Hey guys, what's going on? This is Patrick Foley again, aka Patrick4D. If you guys know me on Instagram or other social media websites, finally coming back with another YouTube tutorial, and we're going to be going over how to make something like this here. And I asked you guys if you would kind of want something like this on YouTube, and you guys said, yeah, it's really simple. We just got a bunch of spheres, but I think the cool part about it is the composition and using dynamics and all that stuff. What I've really been preoccupied with is Skillshare, and that's where I've been posting most of my classes if you guys do not know about them. This is my Skillshare profile here. We just hit 1,500 followers, or students, whatever you want to call them. And I really like this platform better because with YouTube, if I make an hour-long tutorial or whatever, you guys got to scrub through the entire video and be like, okay, where do you talk about this? Cool thing about these is it breaks them down. If I were to just click on one here, it breaks these classes down. Make sure this pauses into sections. So I'm able to kind of break them down based on, this was a simple one. It was only, I think, like 40 minutes, 30 minutes. But I was able to break them down to sections where you guys can actually narrate or navigate to and post your projects, and I can give feedback based on whatever I teach. So I think that's really cool. It's a way to engage with you guys even more. And clicking my kind of special link here will actually get you, it's actually in my bio on Instagram, and I'll put it in the description here as well. This will give you, I think, 2 months free, and it's a subscription-based thing, so the 2 months will be free, and you can watch all the classes I have along with everything else that Skillshare has to offer. I found out about this platform not too long ago, and it's been really great. The stuff I've seen on there from other artists posting, it's not just 3D, it's 2D, painting, finance, anything you can really want to know, they got on here. But just to show you some of that stuff, these are more in-depth than YouTube, and that's kind of why I like them more. But let's get started with this thing right here. Let's start making this. Let's jump into Cinema 4D, and we got a blank template as always, and if anything looks different here, that's just because I've kind of customized my windows and tablets how I want them, or palettes, if you will. And we can kind of start here. And anything that looks different, don't worry, I'll be explaining everything in as much detail as I can. So before we move on here, let's check the render settings. So if you guys don't have this icon here, actually you probably don't because I moved this here specifically. Matter of fact, you know what, let's go to the regular startup so that I can just be on your level playing field. So this is what you're probably seeing. First thing we'll want to do here is go to the render settings and just make sure we have the right resolution or dimensions. And for that, I usually post my stuff on Instagram at 1080 by 1080. As you can see, it's changing the artboard here, or composition layout, to a square because that's the aspect ratio now. And we can click lock ratio. Or if you wanted to do something kind of like this, whenever I bump out an image like this, which takes advantage of the kind of the biggest frame size Instagram has to offer, I usually go 1080 by 1350. So whatever you guys want to do, I guess for now we can keep it at 1080 because I don't know, lately I've been posting square images. And you can lock the ratio there, and so that's what we have going on right there. We got our render settings. We don't really have to worry about the type of renderer yet. We can go there in a second. But first, let's work on kind of building this thing. And if you'll notice, it's really just a bunch of spheres that actually aren't colliding into each other, which is cool. That's how we know we got some dynamics going on. And the big thing about this one is that there's this massive void with this little sphere in the middle. So we're going to be going over how to create that kind of thing. And so what we want to do first is obviously get some spheres. I can delete the camera. We're not messing with cameras yet. So let's go up to this icon here and go all the way to sphere. So we got our first sphere, and I like to kind of see the Gouraud shading lines, if you will, and that kind of allows us to easier see the segments in these things. For this specific tutorial, it won't really matter because we're not going to be editing these things too much. But if you want, you can change this to icosahedron. These are just evenly spaced segments now. And what we want is a bunch of these things, remember? So first thing we're going to do is jump this thing into a cloner. So what we'll want to do is go to MoGraph, Cloner. Now we have the sphere in the cloner. Let's drag the sphere on top of the cloner so that it is a child of the cloner. Now you'll see that we have 3. And if you press play, nothing happens because there are no dynamics, no simulations going on, not yet. And 3 is also not nearly enough of spheres that we need to actually get this thing working. So let's first bump this thing up to, let's change within the settings of the cloner. Let's go to mode and grid array. And now you can see we got a nice little cube of spheres with we got 3 by 3 by 3 kind of spheres in this whole thing. And of course you can adjust any of these settings here. I think what'll work for me here is 8 by 8 by 8, a decent amount that we'll be working with. And just be cautious of how many segments you're using, and I would definitely not push these past anything your computer can handle. But from here on, we can, and if you press play again, nothing happens. We don't have any segments or any simulations going on right now. But we're going to change that right now. So the first thing we're going to do is kind of eliminate gravity. We don't need gravity in this simulation because all that's going to do is make these things fall down. It's going to have to make us, watch for these things even more. So let's go Command D, which will take you to Dynamics or the project menu here, and you're gonna go to Dynamics, and you're gonna go to Gravity. And to the gravity, you're just gonna click 0, and that'll zero out the gravity. Matter of fact, if I just keep it at 1,000, I'll let you see what actually happens here. So if I go to the sphere here and right-click or just click Tags while the sphere is selected, and I go to Simulation Tags, click Rigid Body. So now these spheres are literally going to react to each other, and they're actually in 3D space. So if I click play, they kind of bounce all over the place. And you can see they start falling after the velocity reaches to a certain point, and that's because we have gravity. So if we were to take off gravity, Command D, go to Dynamics, General, Gravity, take it to 0, all of them kind of just burst into space without falling. They kind of go wherever. And they're only bursting because they're colliding with each other in the first place. So if I made them very small and I clicked play, nothing would happen at all because gravity's not affecting them and they're not being colliding with each other. So the next thing you'll want to do is go to Simulate. We're going to add a kind of an attractor to this whole thing because we want these things to kind of stick in one area. So if we were to add a attractor to the center of this thing, and you press play, notice that they're all going to reach the center of this attractor and just spit out. And that's because there's nothing to kind of, once they get to the attractor, they kind of just, they don't know what to do and they just spit out at random at a pretty high velocity. So we kind of need something there, and that's actually, we're going to kill 2 birds with 1 stone. We're going to use the void to kind of take care of that problem. So if you were to create a random, let's say sphere or something like that, and put this in the center and create a tag for it, let's go Collider. Now Cinema will kind of realize that this is a physical object, and everything will react to it appropriately. So once they actually reach the sphere, they have they can't actually reach the attractor, so they'll actually stick there, and that's what we want. So we want that, but not with a sphere. We want that, but with a tube, and that's going to create the void that we want. So if we create a cylinder, click R, rotate this thing, holding down Shift to 90 degrees, and just make it a little bit bigger. Maybe slim it down a little bit. And we right-click the cylinder, Simulation, Collider Body. Now everything should react with the cylinder, and it'll create its own void. Now the first thing I'll do probably is kind of make these spheres a little bigger by just clicking the sphere that's in the child, clicking T, and then just dragging anywhere to increase all the sizes of the spheres. And if I wanted to scale the whole cube of spheres bigger, I would click the cloner. So there's multiple ways you can kind of scale this up and down. We'll increase the sphere just a little bit here. And in order for this to work properly, you just don't want anything colliding with each other. So we're still good. We got some leg room. And another thing here is when you click here, when you click play, notice that they're kind of moving slow and we're almost out of our frame limit here. And some of them actually bounce off. That's because they're colliding already with the cylinder and it's kind of messing everything up. So we can scale down the cloner a little bit to affect less of the spheres. And the best way to kind of get the most out of our simulation here is, one, we can, as you can see, when we press play, I'm gonna try to explain this correctly. When we press play, we're running out of frames here, so the simulation really isn't able to finish, and we're not anywhere near where we need to be. So we can do a couple things here. We can increase the frame. We can go to like 250 instead of 90, and drag this all the way. So now our simulation has much more time to run before everything gets to the center. Another thing we can do is take the attractor and boost the strength up from 10 to like 200. Everything's starting to collide more, and all the ones that are bouncing out are coming back because of how strong that force is. And the only other thing we have to do, we got a couple things, is this looks cool, but there's no void, there's just a cylinder, and all we have to do is not delete the cylinder, but just hide it. So we double click here, and double click here. Double clicking on this first bubble to make it red hides it in the editor like this, and the second bubble will hide it during the render. So we definitely want to make sure the render is hidden here. A lot of people like to edit seeing what things are affecting what, and then when you render it you don't have to worry about it, but for now it's easier just to hide this. And you can see now that we have a clear void in this thing. And the only other thing that I did really, besides as far as creating this composition, is kind of making sure that each of these spheres were kind of sized randomly, and we haven't done that yet. So we're going to refresh the simulation, go back to frame 0. Of course, the invisible void is still there, as you can see. And what we'll want to do is, while clicking on the cloner, you're going to click MoGraph Effector, which is going to affect the whole cloner as a whole. And we're going to go to random. And I don't think we necessarily need to randomize the position, which is by default what it does. We're just going to click within the random settings here. We're going to go to perimeter and uncheck the position. So right now nothing's happening. And we're going to check scale. And then we're going to go to uniform scale, click that, and then mess with this little button a little bit. And as you can see, this is randomizing things a decent bit, but we don't want things to start, once we get to a certain limit, we start overlapping again, and that's going to create glitches. So we want to do it ever so slightly. So something like that probably will work. So we're getting a bunch of randomized spheres, but it's not overboard and we're not colliding with anything. So once we click play again, just let everything load, and we can press pause. Now that's looking better. So we kind of got everything there that we need. And once that's where it needs to be, I think we're good to kind of collapse this thing. Now you can bake this thing, you can do whatever you want, but I think what we'll do for this instance, so we don't have to worry about anything glitching later, a lot of times with the simulation and dynamics, what'll happen is you'll like this and you forget to bake it or compress them into its own kind of object, and you'll come back to the project and it won't be the same at all. It'll be kind of randomized. But if you want to keep this the same, I suggest you, one of the fastest ways I think is to just take the cloner, make sure render instances is checked off so that each of these will become their own object, and then you're just going to make this editable. And when you do that, all of these are its own objects. So you can delete one of them, two of them, whichever ones you want to delete if one of them are messing up the frame. So if you press play, oops, let's go back to frame 1. Let's let this thing load again. Cool. Looking pretty decent. And now we can pause. And once that's done, just click on sphere number 0. Remember, these are all saved as spheres. Looks like we have about 511 of them. Again, don't go too crazy with the system that you're working on. But just click this dynamics tag, shift click the last one, and delete the tags. And now these are 100% stable, and you can move this whole thing as a whole if you want. Again, we got some that are kind of outliers here, so we can just check those and delete them because they really don't serve a purpose at all. And we even got some down there, so delete that, delete that. Just make this thing clean, and I think we got them all. The next thing is setting the camera. I like to do this before texturing and lighting because I get to see what everything kind of looks like under this perfect circumstances that we know we're going to render at. So everything looks good now. We can actually delete the attractor, we can delete the random effector, and we can even delete the cylinder because everything is kind of bumped out here. And if you know you're going to be working on a project like this for a while, maybe don't delete that stuff because you like to go back and be able to edit stuff. In that case, I wouldn't have even compressed these in their own file. I would have just maybe baked them in their own object, and you'll be able to go back. But for this instance, this is totally fine. I'm showing you how to make the simulation I made, so this is what I did. So we're going to create a camera now. We got this camera up here, and we're going to jump in. And of course, before we jump into the camera, we want to make sure we're using this main viewport as the camera viewport. So now, as you can see, we are inside the camera. So when we move now, we are moving as the camera. And if I were to jump out, I would jump out of the camera, jump back in by clicking the square. If the square is white, you are in the camera. So what I'm going to do here is, because this is aligned on the axis, we didn't move anything a crazy amount. It should be perfectly aligned with this camera when I zero out the coordinates. So I'm going to go 0 to the X. Remember, we're in the coordinates here. 0 to the Y. Let's go -800 for Z. And 0 out the rotation. And it looks like we're perfectly centered. Next thing we're going to do is go to Object within the camera settings and go to Portrait. And then from here we can just click on any of these spheres, anything that will allow us to zoom in, and just zoom in ourselves. Let's see, until everything's kind of in frame here. And that should be good. And it's hard to see where the boundaries here, so an easy way to kind of define those boundaries is clicking Shift V. And then you're going to go to the View tab in the Viewport channel or panel. And you're going to go to Opacity 100%. Now you can clearly see what we're going to be looking at here. And I think we're good. We can lock the camera in place. I'm happy with this. We can right-click the camera, Cinema 4D tags, and protection. What that'll do is make it impossible to move the camera now. You cannot move while in the camera. And so you know you can count on saving that position. So the spheres are locked in place and the camera is locked in place. Or I'm sorry, the spheres are not locked in place. If you wanted to do that, you can just Command click and drag on this protection tag, and now these are also locked in place. So I cannot move these things whatsoever. So everything's safe here. The only other thing I did was create a sphere in the middle, which is already centered. And I'll just scale this down, and we'll worry about texturing this in a little bit. So that looks good to me. And right now we got a perfect, everything's perfect so far. We can clearly see the resemblance of what's going on here. Maybe the sphere is a little bigger. Doesn't really matter. And before we start texturing it, I think we're good to start lighting it. So the first thing we're going to do is bump out another panel so we don't have to waste our time only using this panel. And we're going to click Panel, New View Panel here. As you can see, it's another fresh panel for us to use. We're just going to drag this one up here as a secondary view panel. Almost like if you guys are familiar with Octane, having a secondary render viewer thing. And we're going to do the same thing. When you have this clicked, you're going to do Shift V and boost the opacity to 100%. And now this will be kind of our test window to see what everything looks like, our lighting, whatever you want. And the reason I'm making this way smaller is because when you start rendering things, that rendering takes time, and the bigger frame you got to render, the longer the time it will take. And if you're rendering this image the whole time, there's no reason you got to see close-up details just to see what the lighting looks like. And so if you clicked Option R, while you're selected on this window, it'll pop up this window. And if you make sure this box is small enough, if you drag it to the edges, it kind of collapses it for you a little bit. But if you make this box and drag it anywhere like this, it shows you a kind of detailed preview of what you're going to render out. Just going to take a drink real quick. Okay, cool. So we're all set here to start lighting and texturing. Before we do that, let's go back to our render settings. And let's start messing with the specifics of what's going to help make this the fastest and best looking render quality. So you guys are probably stuck on the standard. You're going to change this to physical. And all that's going to do is change this to make sure this physical tab is there. It's the most physically accurate renderer Cinema has built in, and that's kind of why I use it a lot. I've been able to kind of get away with using this render versus Octane. There's pros and cons of going to Octane or other types of renders, but I like to keep it simple, and I like to be able to show you guys how you can make some cool stuff, not relying on any plugins. So the first thing here we're going to do is the output looks correct here. We only got to worry about a single frame. Everything here is fine. I didn't really touch any of it. In the physical tab, usually I worry about depth of field, but for this specific render, we do not need to. There's really no depth of field in this render, which makes these things look kind of bigger. So if I were to make this thing in focus and everything else out of focus, there wouldn't be as much detail, and this thing would look miniature. And so we're going to go back here, and let's make sure we're on the progressive renderer, and have all these settings down to 2. We don't want anything that's going to boost our render times when we only need a simplified image to see what's going on. Next thing are these 2 tabs here. These were already added by me, but to add them, we're going to go to Effect, Ambient Occlusion should be at the top, and Global Illumination should be somewhere around here. So you're just going to make sure those are clicked and checked on. And if you'll see, Ambient Occlusion does a lot already, just based on default lighting, and adds correct shadows to this thing. And remember, the interactive render region is already on, if you followed along so far. So just that added a ton of realism, just adding shadows to everything. Natural shadows, because they are physical objects. Now this next thing here, Global Illumination, is going to it's going to be the thing that really makes or breaks this thing. It's going to boost render time a little bit, but it is going to add all the realism in the world. Before we check that on, we're going to go to Ambient Occlusion and make sure Evaluate Transparency is checked on. Whenever I'm working with glass, I like to make sure that's on, because sometimes glitches can form when using glass and stuff like that. But I usually just always have that checked on. And then Global Illumination. Now when I check this on, it's going to go black because there's no lighting. We're not using default lighting anymore. We're using realistic lighting. So if there's not anything actually emitting light within this composition, it's not going to show, which is realistic. So right now we have our first realistic image, which is black, because there's no external light source hitting anything now. The next thing we'll want to do for the fastest render is go to Samples, Custom Sample Count, and go to something like 20. And you'll notice, if you've been using Cinema for a while, this will give you the kind of splotchy marks that look terrible. But that really doesn't matter when we're making this thing. It only matters when you bump out the final image. So we'll change all these settings in a second. So just make sure this is something small like 20, and we're good to go. Okay, so the next thing here is to give ourselves some light. Really simple. Click over here. Let's create a sky. Already, this thing is kind of emitted by a natural kind of dim light that's hitting this thing, and everything's reacting correctly. The stuff in the back that's getting hit less with light is darker, and we're getting some nice diffused lighting here. Now the first thing we'll want to do is create our first material by double-clicking or create new material, and we can drag this to the sky. And now the sky is kind of white colored, which is changing the color of everything because the only light source there is the thing we're manipulating now. So what you'll want to do is For now, I guess we can keep this as a white material here, kind of opaque white, but we can start to light this thing. So really what we'll do is making sure we're here in the render view. We can hop out of the camera. Again, we are still hopped into the camera on this render viewer, which is perfect. No matter where we move, it will update accordingly. If we change anything in this composition, it will change in that composition. So what we'll do now is, and I think what I want to do is, it's a little hard to see some of the lines, so I think I'll just go in this render view window. Let's go hidden line, a little bit easier to see. So what we want to do now is add some lighting, and if you'll look in this image, there's actually a pretty big light on the top and a light on the bottom of these things, and it's kind of creating that contrast that we're looking for. So what we want to do here is create a plane and drag it up. It doesn't have to be too close to the thing. Let's drag this guy up a little bit more because we want this light relatively soft. And we're gonna add another light, and we can make this material called light. I just created another material, default material, and we're gonna go here and drag it on. You can't see me dragging any of the materials on because I was on the hidden line, but there is a material on this plane now, and all we're gonna do is give it some light. So gotcha. When we double click a material, the material editor pops up here. And so we don't need a color, we don't need reflectance on this light, we need luminance. And if you'll see, that already added a tiny bit of luminance coming from the top. But because it's pretty far away, we'll have to kind of boost this up a little bit. And before we do, let's go to the illumination tab and click GI area light. That'll prevent some splotchiness from the lighting in the future. So we're going to go luminance, boost this to like 200. So there we go, we're getting actually a clear kind of light coming from the top. And actually, if you want to take this light from the sky material, we can take this and go sky. We're not actually going to use any HDRIs, we're just going to use a plain light for this, I believe. And we can take the color down a little bit. There we go. So we can see the more we take the sky light down, the more contrast this light from the top will be hitting this this stuff out here. So we can even take that a little bit more down. Perfect, because this is pretty, yeah, it's pretty drastic, the difference. So I think that's good for now, maybe a tiny bit more. And then we're going to take this same light, command and drag. And now we got light from the bottom and the top hitting this thing. So it's really that simple as far as lighting this thing. I didn't do too much other stuff. I think I may have actually, let's duplicate that one more time and rotate it 90 degrees. And let's go bring it back. And yeah, the only other thing I did really was, let's drag that down, was create a little backlight in the back of the thing. Yeah, something like that. Cool. And even this light, if we duplicate this this light material, just drag it somewhere else, we can target light 2 and delete the current light we have on the material for light number for this third backlight here, just so we don't get confused. Backlight. Drag the second light on here because it doesn't need to be as bright, so we'll go to this light again now and take this down to like 100. There. Again, probably didn't do too much that you can notice, but there, we did it anyway. So that looks good. Again, we're getting some splotchiness, but that's all going to go away when we boost up our samples. Now we just have to mess with, let's create another material, the material of the cloner, or the spheres. So placing it on the kind of folder kind of applies it to everything. So if we were to make them all black, they all turn black, which is not what we want. Let's create some reflectance. And because these lights are physical planes, we'll be able to see the reflections pretty clear on these things. So let's take down the default specular all the way. and add a reflection. And we definitely don't want these things to be chrome like this because that just looks ridiculous. We want to drag them down maybe to like 12. And now we're getting some realistic looking reflections on these things. And before we get started on doing anything else, let's mess with the bump, because these things clearly over here have a bump. And that's what kind of makes these things look realistic. So I think for this specific bump, all I did was go to Texture, Gradient, click the gradient, let's go boost the turbulence up. And it's kind of creating these kind of, actually maybe 100 will do. Should be fine. And now we're kind of starting to see some realistic looking bump on these things. And it's hard to see with this preview render. So what we're going to do actually is click the preview render here, Option R, just get rid of it for now, and get back into the camera on here. And so we'll make Option R within this window, drag this way down to something manageable, and drag this arrow, which is the quality of the render, which starts by default in the middle, and drag it all the way up, so it'll give us the highest quality image here. So we can see these things are getting affected slightly by the bump. Let's drag it somewhere else to get a better picture. Okay, cool. So yeah, they are being affected. We can probably boost the quality up a little bit, and we can actually brighten this thing up a little bit. So let's boost this all the way up, the brightness of these spheres. Yeah, that's fine. And then let's take the bump, and we can take the strength up to like maybe 40. That looks good. So let's see what we're looking at. Big picture here. We can drag this back down. Now that we know we're getting sufficient bump on these things. Gotcha. Okay, that's looking pretty good. And if you'll notice, there's a clear difference in color. This right here looks much more white and bland than this thing. And I think 99, actually 100% of that is due to Photoshop post-processing, which I'll show in a little bit. I was trying to decide whether I should do the Photoshop or just build the thing in here. But yeah, I think we can go through that, whether it's in this video or another one. I got to decide based on time I have right now. But there's one thing we forgot to do, and it's the center texture here. And I can't remember actually if this is glass or if this is just chrome reflective. I think it's chrome reflective that has the illusion of being glass just because of its surroundings. So let's see what happens when we do both. So let's make one last material, drag it on this guy. And just to see a clearer, faster render, we can just smooth this or slim this down. And within this material, this white material, let's kill the color, go to reflectance, and add a reflective material. Yeah, it looks like it was, it could have been both, but for now maybe we can just do a transparent. So delete the reflectance and go transparent, glass. Oh, maybe it was actually, looks like it really might have been reflective material. So something like that. Maybe it had a little roughness to it, 10%. Cool. So whatever one you guys are thinking, I can stick with this for now. And I think that's really it for now, and I think we're ready to bump out to the next step will probably be in post, but render settings. Let's go back before we start busting this thing out. And this is only going to render whatever viewport we're selected as. So we're not selected on this render view, we're selected on this, which really doesn't matter because we're both hopped in the camera. But just remember, if you're hopped out of the camera in this one, make sure this is not the render view, and make sure this one is. So what we're going to do, output settings look correct, 1080 by 1080, physical render fixed. Let's go 5 for the sampling subdivisions, and 4 for the rest of these except for subsurface scattering because we don't have anything with subsurface scattering. And global illumination samples, let's go back to 150, and that's going to kind of deplete all of the splotchiness that we have. So we're just going to click enter the render, and we just got to wait. And I think that's good for now. And you might want to save this. We haven't saved this at all, which is probably my bad, but quick little tutorial. Wanted to show you guys. Again, I appreciate you guys watching at least this video. And I will surely go over the Photoshop techniques. Probably in this video, maybe not. I still haven't decided, but by the time you're watching this, you'll see. And again, please leave a comment. Please leave a rating. And I encourage you guys, if you like this class, there are much more in-depth classes on my Skillshare, on which I'm able to go much more in-depth and more defined. And you guys are able to make arguably way cooler things because I've posted about 10 of these by now. One of them's free, just kind of a layout one. But I go over everything from creating realistic lighting, literally creating your own HDRIs, you know, what makes certain things look realistic, how to turn a 2D logo into a 3D logo, microscopic stuff, just really cool Cinema 4D stuff. So I appreciate you guys watching, and I look forward to you dropping a nice little comment or a like if you liked it. Do whatever you got to do. And if for some reason you haven't found this video from Instagram, I do have an Instagram account where I do post daily renderings of all this stuff. Alright, so that wasn't too bad. Looks like 18 minutes, which actually, it's a lot for something like this, for a still frame, but, you know, to me it doesn't really matter because I only primarily bump out still frames. Definitely some other render settings if you were thinking of animating something like this, but for now this is totally fine. So what we're going to do here is right-click, save as, TIFF layer, PSD, 16-bit to give us some more latitude to color with. And just, I don't know, title this whatever you want. Tutorial image C4D. I don't know, something that you want to call it. And let's jump into Photoshop here and go to our image here that we have and drag it in here. We got it all cool. First thing you want to do, Command J, which duplicates the image. I like to edit non-destructively. Secondary, let's go filter, convert for smart filters, which will allow us to go back and edit the color corrections we make in Camera Raw, which we're about to jump into. So the first thing here is go to Camera Raw filter, and we're going to get this image that we have here and start tweaking with colors. And I think for the image that we had on Instagram, it was a little blue, a little bit of green in there, a little bit more. And the next things we'll want to do is kind of dim down. Let's bring up the blacks a little bit so that when we do add grain, it'll look nice and you know, won't fade away in the black. So bump the blacks up a little bit, maybe even take the whites down a tiny bit. And back in here, let's boost the contrast a little bit. Already we're getting a good look here. And if we zoom in here and we go to Effects tab and we up the grain, gives us just a little bit of realism here. A lot of people ask why you'd want to even add grain in the first place, but it really adds some texture and some realism. So let's bump this up to like 18. Looks good for here. And boost the contrast a little bit. We can darken those shadows. And other than that, maybe adjust the vibrance a tiny bit, make this thing pop a little more. And that's really it. I mean, we can go split toning a little bit. Let's go to the shadows, add in some, let's see, even some green or some browns, so these shadows aren't completely black or kind of singular colored. So that looks cool, maybe around here. And in the highlights, we don't really have to do too much, but sometimes I like to boost it with a little bit of like green or blue. So there's much more going on this image than there was previously, and just by clicking this button right here, we can see that very flat, no color in this image at all, and we pretty much just added all the color we needed in post, and that's really all that I had to do for this image, and that's all it really needs. And you can do other things, of course, like increase the clarity, like however you want this image to look. If you want this to be much more dramatic, increase the clarity, do what you got to do. But we're going to click OK here, and we're not editing destructively because we are editing on a smart filter. So we can double click this camera raw filter and we go right back here with all our same settings. And if you want to kind of create your own preset, you can in the presets tab by clicking this little guy here, and it will save every single part of the preset that you want to make, title it whatever you want, so you can use it for a future use. And to me, this looks actually pretty good. And the last thing I usually do is add an adjustment layer over all this hue and saturation and just see if any other color combos look better. And oftentimes they actually do, so it's a good thing to always mess with at the end. And to me, that looks good. So we can just save this out, and this is ready to post on social media or wherever you want to do with it. So I think we're good. Thanks for watching. Leave a review if you want. It's always good to get these good reviews. It helps my work get out there. And yeah, we'll see you in the next one. Keep searching on, it's never enough. Cup after cup, blunt after blunt. I wouldn't get one if I could find a flaw. In the car, and I put that on my mama. And my bitch call, talking about some drama. I swear there ain't no time for women on a call. It's either pussy or the karma.